morning, everyone.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, as the chairman of ASPI, it's a real privilege to welcome everyone here today to our conference on Australia's future surface fleet. It's a pleasant duty to welcome everyone, but could I say a particular welcome to our sponsors for this event. We like working with the private sector, and we couldn't put events like this out in the public domain without significant private sector support. But to everyone, I trust that you'll find the next couple of days very productive, very informative, stimulating and enjoyable. Ben and the ASPI team have put together an outstanding program of contributors and speakers, beginning with Minister Andrews shortly. And the issues are challenging. There's no question about that, be it in absolute terms or comparative terms. Just a word to everyone present. ASPI welcomes a very robust debate. We like intellectual rigour, we like vigour too, so don't hesitate with the questions, with the observations. The more probing, the more difficult, the better. You won't have a response, ladies and gentlemen, like I had at a Senate Estimates Committee some years ago, where I asked the representative from Defence where could I find the budget allocation for airborne early warning aircraft. And the reply came back, Senator, you will find that in year 6 of the current 5-year rolling program. No responses like that. We like a robust debate. What are we trying to achieve over the next couple of days? Ladies and gentlemen, the best I can distill our objective, our policy goal, is to clarify those issues which enable Australia to match strategic need with advanced but affordable capability. That's our goal. It's now my real privilege to invite Peter Jennings, the Executive Director of ASPI, to open proceedings. Peter.
ASPI's objective for this conference on Australia's future fleet is to allow what government increasingly these days calls a deep dive into the policy challenges presented in thinking about Australia's future surface fleet. Few subjects are subject to so much heat and so little light. Probably the only debate around the future submarine the debate around the future submarine is the only one which generates more media coverage than the debate around the future of the surface fleet. So in some respects, I have Chief of Navy in front of me. Perhaps Navy should count itself lucky to be so much and so often in the country's thoughts as it is around these issues. But for all of the noise, for all of the heated exchanges about cost, capability, construction options and regional security implications, what we at ASPI see is the need to promote a calm, detailed and systematic discussion around Australia's best options. Now, when ASPI was established in 2001, the government gave us a charter to undertake 3 key purposes. First, to provide alternate sources of input to government decision-making on major strategic and defence policy issues. Second, ASPI is intended to help nourish a public debate and public understanding on these issues. And third, our charter asks us to invest in nurturing a body of men and women working both inside and outside government who are expert in the strategic policy issues faced by government. Now, we hope that this conference will, in particular, inform especially the first 2 of these objectives, alternate sources of policy advice and nourishing public debate and understanding. It's clear that some very substantial decisions have to be taken by government in coming months relating to the size and the capabilities of Navy's surface fleet. In terms of cost, the C5000 frigate project will be in the top half dozen of Australia's most expensive defence capability decisions. These decisions will have major knock-on impacts for Australian industry, both in terms of construction and sustainment. In the time it takes for the ships to be designed, constructed, brought into service and operated, these will be decisions that take decades to implement and will be carried forward through many federal and state elections. And all of these reasons mean that it's essential that government makes the best decision that it can. Success will mean a strong Navy, making a powerful contribution to regional stability and a strong industry base to support it. Failure would mean opportunities lost in terms of Australia's global and regional position, damage to industry, and in all likelihood, endless parliamentary inquiries and, who knows, royal commissions. So over the next few days, I hope we have the chance to work through some of these challenges that confront decision makers. Now, there are people from very many different roles and walks of life here today, and some have indeed very competitive interests in the decisions that government will make about C5000 and related service fleet projects. But I imagine that all of us here would agree that we want C5000 and related projects to succeed. So here we have a chance to help shape government, opposition, official and industry thinking to this common objective. Now, before we hear from the Minister, I would like to suggest that there are 5 clear objectives that need to be met in order for government to make the right decisions on Australia's future surface fleet. And the first of those objectives is that government needs to make decisions around the surface fleet based on Australia's strategic outlook and strategic need. Now, I said a similar thing almost precisely this time last year at ASPI's submarine conference. The fact is that Australia faces a less predictable and more risky strategic outlook. We see a greater willingness on the part of some powers to use military force, and there is no slackening of the growth of military capability in the Asia-Pacific. Now, this does not have to mean conflict, although I think we're in a period as difficult for the region as was the period of the mid-1960s, a time when disputes fled into conflict involving a number of countries. And so for Australia, what this means is that we have to sharpen up our strategic thinking. Pursuit of the status quo is likely to lead to an overall diminution of our ability to protect our interests. And in this environment, and because of our geography, a strong maritime capability is a prerequisite for a strong Australian strategic role in the Asia-Pacific and beyond. Now, the debate around the shape of Australian industry is important, but it surely must be led by understanding the uses of military capability. I expect a theme that we will hear from a number of speakers at this conference is that our friends and allies increasingly need Australia to step forward to play a more prominent maritime role in regional security. And so the right decision on C5000 is going to be a crucial part of designing Australia's future strategic posture in the region. A second strategic objective that I would point to is that we need to understand Australia is playing on a broader canvas than it has in the past. The ANZAC frigate decision of the 1980s was a decision of a different strategic era. If you think about that time, China was only just beginning its remarkable transformation of economic growth. In the mid-1980s, the combined ASEAN defence budget was smaller than the Australian defence budget. Before 1987, we looked out at the South Pacific and we saw a model of post-colonial stability. And against that backdrop, it was possible to acquire a relatively small vessel. Many people here will remember the phrase fitted for but not with weapon systems, and to see its role in a very limited regional sense. Now, all of the strategic drivers which have impacted on Australia's interests in the last decade or so have moved us away from that situation. We need to think about the Navy's surface fleet as a key element of Australia's interests in a bigger and more integrated international system. For example, we're so economically tied to North Asia that we can no longer pretend our strategic interests are not engaged there. Likewise, we're deeply interested in the stability and the continued growth prospects of Southeast Asia. Maritime capabilities will be a major part of our defence engagement strategy with countries in an expanding region. So our need for reach and our need for enhanced capability should drive clear capability outcomes for C5000 and other projects. Now, my third objective is to turn to domestic issues and to say that I think it's important we try to take some of the heat out of the domestic policy debate. Politics has played hard in Australia, ladies and gentlemen, at the federal level and between the Commonwealth and the states. Behind the daily cut and thrust, all participants realise that major defence projects of the kind that last for decades will inevitably, over the lives of those projects, be managed by governments of different political stripes. Today's critics will sooner or later become tomorrow's custodians. I think we need better mechanisms for governments to discuss long-term defence projects with their state and federal counterparts. We should look to the Council of Australian Governments, COAG, to develop a conversation with states on defence projects. We can't afford to leave this to the hardline positions that emerge from heavy political campaigning. Likewise, the adversarial and often media-driven nature of estimates committees and other committee hearings don't always produce the best outcomes for sustainable policy. I think we need to look at lower-profile ways to keep parliamentarians involved and understanding the complexities of defence acquisition. And that takes me to my fourth objective, which is to suggest to defence industry players that they need to be prepared to raise their voices more actively in talking with government about the right role for industry in capability development. It's clear that peak bodies and state lobby groups will be increasingly active players, but my view is that major firms need to be more actively making their cases as well. And this is surely going to be necessary as reforms point to a greater role for industry in capability development. So at this conference and elsewhere, my message is don't lose the opportunity. Have some forceful things to say. If you disagree with some of the common themes emerging in our public debates about defence capability, then be prepared to deal yourselves into that debate. This is a role industry must play if it's going to be an active partner in reshaping capability development in Australia. And finally, my fifth observation is to point to the increasing need to think about the integration challenges which will be presented by major capability decisions. For so much of this, we talk the talk about the importance of integration, but ultimately we seem to put real priority on platforms rather than the systems integration that turns platforms into effective weapon systems and networks them across the ADF and with our allies and friends. We have to keep reminding ourselves that a platform-centric approach will not deliver the capabilities we need or it will hamper our ability to use these systems to their full potential. So, ladies and gentlemen, these are my 5 pointers for what, for me, are some of the key issues and themes which I hope will be discussed over the next few days. I hope we have a thoroughly interesting and useful conference. Now, as my chairman, Stephen Leasley, said, we would not be in a position to hold this event without our sponsors. And in this respect, I would like to thank our prime sponsors, Lockheed Martin, Saab and Thales, and our sponsors, the DMO, Raytheon Australia, BAE Systems, Navantia, ThyssenKrupp Marine Systems, Austal, Defence SA and the state governments of Victoria. We deeply appreciate the support we've received from these organisations. It's now my job to hand over to Raden Gates, Chief Executive of Lockheed Martin Australia and New Zealand, who will introduce the Minister for Defence. Raden, over to you.
Thanks very much, Peter. Can I take the opportunity also to welcome everyone here, particularly Minister Andrews, Shadow Minister Dave Feeney, Admiral Harris and distinguished guests all. Start off by saying thank you to ASPI for the opportunity and for hosting this conference. As Peter has already said and Stephen Loosley has already said, this is a critical matter. If you were also at the Future Submarine Conference last week, there is no doubt that the maritime interest, the maritime criticality of what lays ahead of us is in the forefront of all our minds. It is all about shaping the future fleet. And as an ex-admiral, something that's very, very close to my heart, and I know many, many people here. And it's of interest to all of us, and particularly the sponsors, and I know I speak for all when I say that companies like myself, like Lockheed Martin Australia, we're committed to partnering with local industry and leveraging our large-scale engineering and world-class systems engineering capabilities and experience to make this future fleet a reality for all of us. And to do that, it's going to fall heavily on the person I'm about to introduce, the Minister for Defence. So we're very fortunate to have, giving the opening address, Minister for Defence, Hon Kevin Andrews. He's going to be at the forefront of the decision-making, that very serious decision-making that lays ahead. And I know that he'll be interested to take our information in as much as to depart his. Kevin Andrews is a member of Parliament of great experience. He became a Member of Parliament in 1991 on the seat of Menzies in Victoria, and he's held the defence portfolio since December 2014. Before that, as you're probably all aware, he was the Minister for Social Security in the current government and also held ministerial appointments in the Howard government between 2001 and 2007. I first had the pleasure of meeting the Minister at Newcastle when he came up and opened one of our new facilities up there. And to me, he strikes me as very much a quiet reformer, someone who's obviously getting on with the job. And it's obviously to me that the Minister has a major goal to ensure that defence is well structured and to address the future threat. And on that note, Minister, I invite you to step forward and deliver the keynote address, please.
Thank you very much, Roden. To the Chairman of ASPI, Stephen Loosley, and the Executive Director, Peter Jennings, to my parliamentary colleague, the Shadow Minister for Defence, David Feeney, to the Chief of Navy, Vice Admiral Tim Barrett, to Admiral Harry Harris, the Commander of the US Pacific Fleet, Commodore Dean McDougall, the Deputy Chief of Navy for the Royal New Zealand Navy, to the many other distinguished guests here this morning from Australia and around the world, ladies and gentlemen. Well, it's a great pleasure to be here this morning to address this conference of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. As many of you know, for more than a decade, ASPI has positioned itself as a very significant contributor to the national security debate in Australia, and our nation is much richer for that contribution. Your contribution has gone beyond ASPI's role of providing contestable advice on defence issues. ASPI's Executive Director, Peter Jennings, serves as the Chair of the Government's Defence White Paper Expert Panel, along with the assistance of Andrew Davies. And that panel is contributing to the analysis and drafting of both the 2015 White Paper and Force Structure Review and providing much valued independent advice to government. The panel has led targeted community engagement to allow members of the public to participate in a constructive discussion about Defence's priorities and indeed its future directions. They've also engaged on defence industry matters such as capabilities that support and sustain defence, defence industry relationships and industry programs for defence. So I welcome this opportunity to discuss Australia's future submarine fleet, surface fleet I should say. That was last week's submarines. It's a fast-moving portfolio. As the government is in the midst of finalising its Defence White Paper, the Force Structure Review, the First Principles Review, the Defence Industry Policy, and certainly, but not least, an enterprise-level naval shipbuilding plan. Ladies and gentlemen, the 2015 Defence White Paper, to be released later this year, will provide a costed, affordable and enduring plan to achieve Australia's defence and national security objectives. The White Paper is being developed in a considered and methodological manner and will reflect the government's strategic, national security, fiscal and broader policy priorities. It will outline a strategy for securing Australia's strategic interests in the period over the next 2 decades to 2035 and beyond. The White Paper will align defence policy with a clear military strategy and a credible, affordable and properly funded ADF structure designed to achieve that policy. It will set out the strategic objectives that the government expects its defence to be able to carry out, which will be underpinned by a fully costed force structure review. And the government will ensure that defence is properly funded to meet these objectives. Most importantly, it will propose options for the force structure that ensure that the capabilities that enable modern joint operations, such as surveillance, communications and logistics infrastructure, are robust and resilient. Succeeding in the future operating environment will depend on more than just high-end capabilities. It's the ability to integrate and share information between platforms and systems in a timely manner that will make the ADF a truly fifth-generation force and one which will give us a distinct edge over many other countries. Along with the White Paper, the government will deliver a costed acquisition program, a 10-year defence capability plan and a new defence industry policy statement. The defence capability plan will be realistic, affordable and provide project approvals with clear timeframes. This guidance, combined with the government's commitment to return defence spending to 2% of GDP within the decade, will improve industry confidence to plan for projects including development of infrastructure skills and capabilities for the future. It will also restore the compact that should rightly exist between the government and the Defence Force in this nation. Key to the government's considerations are the effects on the overall investment plan of the so-called mega projects, the future frigate, future submarine and armoured vehicles, that will ensure a significant amount of the available capital funding in expenditure over the coming 2 decades. The Force Structure Review is carefully considering funding provisions that allow for adequate and appropriate backing for all of these projects, while preserving the appropriate balance of investment across all necessary areas of ADF and defence capability. Ladies and gentlemen, the fact that 2 of these mega projects are naval programs is the fact that underlies the development of appropriate maritime forces, which is central to the government's strategic objectives that will be laid out in the new Defence White Paper. Australia's national security and our $1.6 trillion economy rely upon unencumbered use of the sea. 70% of Australia's exported goods and services by value travel by sea, an export trade worth more than $220 billion in 2012-13. We are a maritime nation and we need maritime security. And maritime security requires a robust surface force capability. The Naval's air warfare destroyers will underpin the surface force's warfighting capability. But with 3 destroyers in the fleet, the future frigate must also be capable of conducting operations independently or in a task group. The ANZAC class frigates were originally designed as a low-intensity patrol frigate, but their role has expanded over time. They've become the workhorse for the Navy, operating across a range of peacetime and military roles, both independently and in task groups. This required successive investments in new capabilities for the ANZAC fleet to keep pace with their expanding roles. At a maximum displacement of 3,900 tonnes, the ships are approaching their weight and stability limits, which will constrain further upgrades. Drawing in part from the experience of the future frigates, are expected to face a more demanding operational requirements in the future and will need to be more capable than the existing ANZAC class. They were required to conduct a range of missions, from low-level constabulary roles through to the regional conflict. but with particular focus on anti-submarine warfare and theatre-level anti-submarine operations. These requirements reflect the modernisation and expansion of regional submarine fleets that is underway, to the extent that by 2030 it is estimated that approximately 300 submarines are expected to be operating in our region of the world alone. Operating along Australia's coastline, northern approaches and throughout the Indo-Pacific will require the future frigate to have the range, endurance, seakeeping qualities, survivability and weapons load out to support prolonged operations throughout our substantial region and when called upon to do so globally. The nature of the threat environment will require the vessels to be equipped with a range of offensive, defensive and self-protective systems. They need to be of adequate displacement to facilitate a growth path for future weapons systems and sensors. And that's one of the reasons why there is something of a global trend towards larger size frigates. Defence and industry are currently conducting risk reduction design studies to investigate a number of options for future frigates, including the viability of an evolved Hobart class as a possible solution. Consideration has also been given to a range of alternative foreign designs, such as the Type 26 and FREM frigates, amongst others. In considering all the available options, the government will be guided by a number of key principles, including the necessity for a well-integrated designer, builder and supplier team, preferencing mature designs of vessels rather than choosing to design a new class of vessel from scratch or undertaking large-scale modifications of existing designs, thoroughly testing Navy's capability requirements against more readily available military vessels, limiting the amount of changes to the design for a unique Australian requirement, and spending more time at the beginning of the project on planning the design and build program. Whilst these principles will, in the first part, apply to our consideration of the future frigate, all defence capability programs related to naval ships should be in conformance with these guidelines and with the capability and acquisition processes to be recommended in the first principles review. The ANZAC class frigates are planned to be withdrawn from the mid-2020s, and at least some of the ANZAC ships are likely to require a modest life extension. There is a strategic imperative to avoid a capability gap during the transition from the ANZAC class frigate to the future frigate. Ladies and gentlemen, the gap between completion of the AWD project and the start of the future frigate project, Labor's Valley of Death, cannot be avoided, and no decision that the government could take can change that now. Those decisions needed to be taken during the past 6 years of the previous government. For 6 years, the previous government failed to make the decisions needed in our shipbuilding industry, including decisions on the replacement frigates for the ANZAC fleet, but also on the replacement for the Collins-class submarines. And for all their posturing in 6 years, Labor did not commission a single naval vessel from an Australian yard. Instead, $16 billion was ripped out of defence, leading to 119 defence projects being delayed, 43 projects being reduced in scope and 8 projects cancelled, raising critical capability gaps. But while the Valley of Death can't be prevented now, it is important, we believe, to attempt to lessen it. In addition to the future frigates, the government is also progressing other projects that will create additional opportunities to move into a design, build and sustainment phase for the Australian shipbuilding industry. A fleet of offshore patrol vessels to replace the Armidale-class patrol boats, and the Australian manufacture of up to 21 Pacific patrol boats under the Pacific Maritime Security Program. Both projects will represent a significant investment in Australian defence industry. However, the size and complexity of the future frigates dictate that it's decisions made on that particular project that go to the very heart of the Commonwealth's commitment to ensure a sustainable naval shipbuilding industry. Ladies and gentlemen, the future force we are seeking to develop will be built on the solid foundation that was provided by the Howard government. Our air capabilities are being transformed through already agreed plans, the result of which can be seen in the skies over Iraq today. The last decade has seen substantial investment in our land forces, with future emphasis on new armoured vehicles, digitisation and enablers. What we now require is a major program of modernisation for our naval forces, with key decisions to be taken on submarines, frigates and patrol vessels. We're in the early stages of an ambitious program to procure up to 40 naval surface ships and submarines over the next 2 decades. And so we have to be in a far better position to understand the ability of Australian shipyards, workers and suppliers to produce, deliver and sustain those vessels at a pace and in the order required by the Australian Defence Force. That's why an enterprise-level naval shipbuilding plan is currently being developed to provide for the long-term future of the Australian naval shipbuilding industry. This is important work and it's been informed by expert independent advice from the RAND Corporation. Ladies and gentlemen, one of the options we're looking at to sustain a shipbuilding industrial base and avoiding the peaks and troughs we're experiencing and have experienced in the past is the feasibility of a continuous build strategy with a regular pace of delivering new warships. This would require Defence to carefully manage its acquisition processes and keep the future frigates operational for a relatively less time than has been the norm to date. By adopting such an approach, the industry would no longer be characterised by a stop-start approach to naval shipbuilding. It is now clear that the current approach was expensive, provided no long-term certainty for workers, and didn't enable industry to make the necessary investments, provide the necessary skill base and build on construction improvements and skills. So for its part, industry also needs to step up to meet the challenge of building a sustainable naval sector. The only way Australia can continue to have a naval shipbuilding industry is if industry is properly structured to drive efficiencies and improve productivity. This will require hard decisions and a commitment to a productivity-based culture from all parties, including unions. Our experience with the AWDs has underlined the need for strong shipbuilding capability and complex project management skills in senior management across the shipbuilding workforce. Without shipbuilding experience in management, it is difficult to manage a block build across multiple subcontractors. Moreover, a lack of management experience in shipbuilding leads to inadequate supervision, development and training of the workforce. Ultimately, a workforce without shipbuilding experience adds a large Australian build premium. The Australian naval shipbuilding industry that will build our next generation of frigates will need to be a different industry. The industry currently isn't internationally competitive in terms of its productivity, and if this does not change, it will not be sustainable. Australian taxpayers currently pay a price premium of at least 30 to 40% greater than US benchmarks to build naval ships in Australia, and even greater premium when measured against other naval shipbuilding nations. That price premium is simply too high to make it good economic sense. As it currently stands, it is too high to enable a continuous build strategy to be adopted in this country. The opportunity cost associated with the defence capabilities which could be foregone as a result of paying that premium are too great for any responsible government to consider. Ladies and gentlemen, the government recognises the significant value to our nation of having a skilled naval shipbuilding industry. We don't want to see this industry disappear. So the government will be making further announcements in the forthcoming Defence White Paper and the accompanying Naval Shipbuilding Plan. This will include more detail on the commencement of ship construction, the rate of the warships to be constructed and the structure of the naval shipbuilding industry that will be required to support this program. Unlike the previous government, the Coalition does not want to see the Australian shipbuilding industry disappear. The plans we are committed to developing will ensure that Australia has a sustainable shipbuilding industry that delivers the right capability at the right time and for the right price to the ADF and supports shipbuilding jobs in Australia. We are committed to working closely with industry to bring this about. The safety and security of all Australians demands no less. Through introducing new management structures, providing the opportunities to invest in new production techniques and allow efficiencies in skilled construction to be harnessed with a long-term build program, the naval shipbuilding program and its industry will look and operate very differently to how it operates today. So thank you for the opportunity of giving you a brief overview and outline of what we hope to achieve in this area. I wish you well with your deliberations and look forward to your future contributions to national security debates in Australia.
David Feeney is the Australian Labor Party member for the seat of Batman and Melbourne. He has a number of roles in his shadow portfolios: Shadow Assistant Minister for Defence, Shadow Minister for Justice, Shadow Minister for Veterans Affairs, and also for the centenary of ANZAC. You'll have to tell us what you do in your spare time, David. David transitioned from the Senate to the House of Representatives at the 2013 election. As a senator, he was Parliamentary Secretary for Defence between 2010 to 2013. Before becoming a senator in 2008, Mr Feeney was the Assistant National Secretary for the ALP, including during the 2007 election campaign. And prior to that, he was Director for Strategy with the Victorian Premier Steve Bracks. He's also been State Secretary for and Campaigning Director for the Victorian ALP. Many people here would know that David has a particular interest in South Pacific issues, which he has focused on very strongly in his time as a parliamentarian, as well as on defence force structure matters. David is now going to address us on the opposition's view. Please welcome David Feeney.
Good morning and thank you very much. Can I begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land and their elders past and present. Can I thank Stephen Loosely and Peter Jennings very much for the opportunity to speak with you this morning about this very important subject. It speaks to the fact that ASPI maintains a strong defence dialogue of a bipartisan character. And that is something for which I'm very grateful, and the opportunity to meet with you and to discuss these important issues is one that is very welcome to me. Can I acknowledge Vice Admiral Tim Barrett, Chief of Navy, and can I also acknowledge Lieutenant General Angus Campbell, who is with us and will soon be Chief of Army. Congratulations on your appointment. Can I acknowledge the many international guests who are with us today, and it's great to see participants from the United States, from New Zealand, the United Kingdom and Germany, international guests here from Spain. Wonderful to have you in the audience today. And can I also thank the sponsors who make this event possible. This is obviously a very big subject, and when I was turning my mind to how I would address it, I guess I thought the right place to start is at the beginning. Why do we need a surface naval fleet? What is it that the country requires it to do? And having defined that, how do we acquire it and how do we sustain it? And so the conversation properly begins with a consideration of Australia and its place in the global order. And has been discussed by the previous speaker, the Minister, and indeed by Peter Jennings in his opening remarks. This is something that is well understood but of course foundational to our thinking. Australia aspires to live in a stable and rules-based international system. We live in a multilateral world, an increasingly multilateral world, where we seek to promote human rights and democratic values. Our economy, our prosperity relies on a secure global commons, one that enables the free exchange of goods, services and ideas. And so, of course, as we consider those challenges, we see that we are a trade-dependent nation, and our trade is dependent upon sea connections, and those sea connections, for the most part, travel through the Indonesian archipelago, where there are key choke points, And when we consider these issues, they go to our capacity as a nation to enjoy and continue to enjoy our lifestyle and our strong economic position based on free trade and open trade. The exemplar of some of these challenges is our nation's acute dependence on the seaborne importation of energy supplies, fuel. Our domestic demand for oil is set to double between now and 2035. Automotive fuel is entirely sourced from overseas, from Singapore, Taiwan and Korea. And some 70% of our fuel comes through the Indonesian archipelago. Australia has no strategic oil reserve, no national champion oil company, and we are the only International Energy Association member state that fails to meet our minimum net oil holdings standards. On that basis, we could only sustain as a nation some 6 weeks' usage of oil in the event of a supply disruption. That, of course, is the picture in terms of key strategic imports, but our exports are of vital significance not only to ourselves and our economy, but indeed to other nations too. Australia is on track to become the world's largest exporter of LNG, with our principal customers being China, Taiwan and Japan. And by 2018, Australia will meet more than 50% of Asia's LNG needs. So, maritime security and good order at sea are a vital national interest. And we can see, when we look at the strategic picture that Australia confronts now and into the future, that there are challenges we need to take very seriously indeed. There are tensions in the Southeast Asian waters. Geopolitics is becoming more multipolar. There are new powers rising. There is obviously sources of anxiety that are well understood, the US-China relationship, the China-Japan relationships, but there are other relationships which are of acute interest to us as well, in ASEAN and of course the relationship between China and India. The Indo-Pacific is becoming wealthier, its militaries are becoming more capable. In contemplating this picture and all of its complexity, previous white papers have articulated the fact that Australia will adopt a maritime strategy. And this maritime strategy was defined most particularly in the 2013 Defence White Paper, of course, beginning in the 2009 White Paper, and I'm sure we will see again in the White Paper to be released later this year, this strategy again sit at the centre of Australian defence thinking. And it's worth touching on the specifics of Australia's maritime strategy. It is, and I read, controlling the sea and air approaches to our continent is the key to defending Australia, in order to deny them to an adversary and provide maximum freedom of action for our forces. This strategy is focused on the maritime domain and aims to deter adversaries from conducting attacks against Australia or attempting coercion, to achieve and maintain air and sea control in places and at times of our choosing in our approaches, to deny or defeat adversary attacks and to protect key sea lines of communication, to deny adversary forces access to forward operating bases or the freedom to conduct strikes against Australia from beyond our maritime approaches, and to project power by deploying joint task forces in the Indo-Pacific region and support the operations of regional partners when required. Such a strategy does not imply a purely defensive approach. The ADF would seek to undertake operations against an adversary's bases and forces in transit, and as far from Australia as possible. This might involve using strike capabilities and the sustained projection of power by joint task forces, including amphibious operations in some circumstances. So, ladies and gentlemen, the strategic guidance that sits at the heart of our nation's military strategy, the maritime strategy, has very profound implications for shaping this conversation and very profound implications for what we ask of the ADF, the capabilities that it must muster and the doctrine with which it must manage those and deploy those capabilities. The capacity to establish sea control, together with the more traditional objective of sea denial, is now required of our Royal Australian Navy and the ADF as a whole. The ADF and the Navy must have the capabilities to then exploit sea control and accomplish military sea lift, potentially blockade, embargo or quarantine operations, the protection of shipping, maritime power projection, including naval strike, amphibious assaults, amphibious raids and withdrawals, and of course amphibious operations are intrinsically joint and are generally held to be the most complex operations an ADF or any military can be called upon to manage and operate. We are requiring our forces to then master notions such as littoral manoeuvre and ship-to-objective manoeuvre, sea basing, and the capacity to continuously support, sustain and project joint forces without reliance on land bases. Above and beyond these requirements, the flexibility of naval forces means that operations, whether they be military, diplomatic or constabulary operations, are asked of our Navy. Humanitarian assistance and disaster relief and non-combatant evacuation operations, new challenges and the new black, if you like, anti-submarine warfare and the growing requirement upon our ADF to master ASW, and old new challenges, mine countermeasures and mine warfare. All of these things are now asked of the ADF and in particular our Navy. All of these capabilities need to be found in our surface naval fleet. I'd like to touch upon some of the areas that are of particular interest to me, but I think need to be a part of this conversation too. And that is those operations which are often described as low end, but notwithstanding that descriptor, they are complex and they are high tempo, and they have implications for Navy and its surface fleet. The first is the Pacific Maritime Security Plan, a plan focused on the South Pacific. And I mention this for a number of reasons. This is the South Pacific is obviously a sphere where Australia has traditionally played a leadership role together with New Zealand, and that leadership role will be an enduring requirement. Sewing together maritime control and surveillance capabilities in the region is acutely in our national interest. And there are a number of goals Australia should seek to achieve in the South Pacific that should properly arrest our attention. There are goals in terms of counter-terrorism, in combating illegal, underreported fishing, and making sure that agencies that are currently in embryonic form, such as the Forum Fisheries Agency based in Honiara in the Solomon Islands, and the Pacific Transnational Crime Coordination Centre in Apia in Samoa, that those organisations grow into ones which are able to be joint and capable entities operating across all of the Pacific Island countries, and making sure that Australia is able to support effective law enforcement and defence of sovereignty in this region that is of great interest to us. That means that the task for Navy in this region is not simply to make sure that there are 21 or 22 Pacific patrol boats that are then gifted to these Pacific Island countries, but in fact is far more complex. It means continuing to put Navy personnel into those countries, the technical assistance and the maritime advisors that have made our presence in that region just so powerful, and it means stepping it up again to another level in terms of making sure that there is stronger surveillance and queuing of those assets, and again, inevitably, to my way of thinking, that would be a Navy-led activity. That is something that policymakers must appropriately turn their minds to. It is an important national task, and it goes to what is required of Navy in our surface fleet. So too in the Antarctic territories, and in Antarctica, as we all know, Australia lays claim to some 43% of that continent, but that is a claim that is coming under increasing pressure. We must continue to invest as a nation in our air and sea connections to Antarctica, We must build Australia's presence in that region so as to give life to our claim to 43% of that continent. And that means air and sea connections. That goes to the shipbuilding task in this country. We saw at the start of this year the contract process for the replacement of the icebreaker Aurora Australis fall over. When we consider the shipbuilding task in this country, we must remember that activities such as building and promoting the Australian presence in Antarctica deserves its place in that story. As I touched upon when looking at the whole ambition for our surface navy, perhaps the grandest of them is the amphibious ready group. The very significant ambition for ADF, and a capability that is able to undertake high-intensity operations as well as play a keynote role in HANDR operations. A big challenge for all of our services, not only Navy, but again, something that should sit at the heart of our consideration, and something that again goes to the shipbuilding task. The LHDs, the AWDs that are to protect those LHDs, the ship-to-shore connectors, the landing craft, sewing all of that together into a capability that is real, that will inevitably be an extraordinarily significant challenge for ADF and for government. So, as we survey the challenges that confront us, the shipbuilding task for Australia is a very significant one indeed. We know what the strategic guidance is, we know what we want our Navy to do. The challenge now is to acquire and sustain that Navy. Over the next 20 years, the Royal Australian Navy will require some 80 new ships and submarines, something over 200,000 tonnes, on top of the 65,000 tonnes already nearing completion with the 2 LHDs and the 3 AWDs. Frigates, patrol boats, Pacific patrol boats, supply ships, our mine hunters and hydrographic ships, landing craft. In total, the Royal Australian Navy will go from some 140,000 tonnes to around 280,000 tonnes by 2030. We must have a potent, superior surface combatant and submarine capability to provide deterrence and to achieve our capability requirements, and that task is a very significant one indeed. The potential cost of this expansion is some $100 billion for acquisition, with through-life support estimated to cost taxpayers an additional $150 billion over many years. As I've touched upon, there are additional vessels required by other government agencies that have their place in this story. Customs, with operating new Cape-class boats and other requirements, multi-role vessels for Australian Antarctic operations, and indeed scientific ships for the CSIRO. The Minister, in his remarks earlier, spoke of the price premium that is paid for shipbuilding in this country. And while that point is a reasonable one, it is as nothing if it is not properly contextualised. The critical issue, to my way of thinking, is that government has never developed an effective long-term shipbuilding plan that can cost-effectively support the needs of the Royal Australian Navy while sustaining the Australian industrial shipbuilding base. For Labor, the approximately $250 billion expenditure that this country will make over the next few decades in building the Navy that our strategic guidance asks for and calls for is not only an enormous challenge, but it is a tremendous opportunity. An opportunity to establish a national shipbuilding program that achieves certain key goals. The sheer volume of the work should enable a rational shipbuilding plan that sustains a continuous build for our shipyards. Our failure to accomplish that in the past cannot simply be laid at the door of shipbuilding industry. It must also be laid at the door of policymakers. A rolling production model with designs kept in production, amortising costs over a greater number of hulls is obviously the way forward. Production efficiency improves as the workforce gains experience with the design. This is a truism of shipbuilding, and it is a lesson beaten into me every time I visit a shipyard in this country. Beyond the hulls, commonality enables economies of scale to be realised in platform systems, whether they be diesels, pumps, air conditioning, refrigeration, motors and electrics, and of course the weapons systems, reducing through-life costs of the fleet. High-level examples include the combat and propulsion control systems, such as the commonalities that exist between the AWD and the LHD. In this way, we can achieve the strategic goal of having an Indigenous national industrial base that supports the Royal Australian Navy. Labor believes that Australian shipyards, supported by a rational and far-sighted DCP, can achieve a continuous build program that achieves quality and value for money for taxpayers. This belief by Labor is the fruit of experience. Australia has done it before. In the ANZAC frigate program and indeed in the Collins programs, we saw the success of a fixed price, single prime contractor model. As Labor has argued in the case of the submarine debate, so too with ships. The skills base required to build new ships strongly overlaps those required to support them through life. It is essential to manage workflows in order to retain and nurture essential workforce skills. Further, experience tells us that through-life costs and the reliability of supplied parts is often very poor for vessels that are purchased entirely from overseas. The boom and bust models of shipbuilding have been ruinous for Australian shipbuilding. And there have been attempts by government to remedy this problem. The ANAO report into the air warfare destroyer said very plainly that taxpayers had paid a $1 billion premium for those vessels to be built in Australia, but it was a premium paid to reach a policy intent, to build a skilled workforce, to build a world-class shipyard from a greenfield site, to lift the limited base of the shipbuilding industry and ensure that the industry was fit for purpose for the national shipbuilding task that we all knew was coming down the road. The vessels and platforms that I've described to meet the capability requirements of government that I've described. Instead of having those facilities and that workforce fit for purpose to meet that national shipbuilding task, we have the valley of death. We have job losses, we have lost investment, and we have a premium that was paid by taxpayers on the AWD project to apparently no avail. Labor believes that the value of the Australian shipbuilding industry requires a more holistic assessment than it currently receives from this government. In particular, the strategic overlay, the importance of having a local industry able to build, repair and maintain the Royal Australian Navy. A wider economic assessment, the value that high-end manufacturing makes to the overall complexity of the Australian economy, and I guess we would point to analysis such as those made in the United Kingdom, which have argued that every procurement dollar spent in the United Kingdom realises dollars in their economy. The valley of death was an avoidable set of circumstances. And today, in the Minister for Defence's remarks, we saw the government finally run up the white flag on whether the valley of death can be bridged. Labor went to the last election with a plan to bridge the valley of death through the construction of 2 Navy support ships. And the context of that, you will remember, is that the Cantabria had just spent some 12 months in our primary operational environment working with the Royal Australian Navy. That resolve of Labor's to build those ships here in Australia was criticised, with some virtue by the likes of Warren King, who said that they were sick of building onesies and twosies, that it didn't achieve the goal of a long continuous build, and of course in that they were right. But what it did do, and what it would have achieved, is making sure that our shipyards and those workforces and that industrial capability would have remained in good repair and fit for purpose for the national shipbuilding task that is upon us. In that vein, I note the recent decision of the United Kingdom to purchase offshore patrol vessels and have those built in their own shipyards, because they reached the conclusion that paying more for ships they could acquire overseas was absolutely justified by the fact that that activity in the United Kingdom's shipyards would keep that industrial capability, a capability of national significance, alive and ticking over and economic, so that it could then continue the national shipbuilding task of the United Kingdom. They managed a holistic analysis that reached that conclusion, but this country has failed. The Coalition abandoned our plan to build those ships in Australia, instead insisting that only Spanish and Korean shipyards could tender for that work. And my main grievance about that decision was the false claim from the Abbott government at the time that Australian shipyards lacked the capacity and the capability to do that work. Simply not true. Instead of adopting a plan to bridge the Valley of Death, the Abbott government resolved upon the Winter Review, a review into the AWD project, a review of great significance. And in order to conduct that review, the government selected people who frankly are at the very top of their craft. And we were very, very interested indeed to see what the Winter Review would say about the Australian shipbuilding industry, the AWD project, but indeed the lessons for the shipbuilding industry more generally, and the raison d'etre of that report, finding a way forward for shipbuilding in this country. That was a report that was handed to government in April of 2014. And at the time that the report was handed to government, government promised to make that report public. And I, for one, would have read it with enormous enthusiasm, not simply because I have so much respect for its authors, but because of the profound importance of the subject matter. That report remains a secret. The only thing we can be sure of in that report is that its recommendations were largely unimplemented, that its plan to save our shipbuilding industry it remains unknown. The little I can say about it is the rumour and innuendo that swirls around our community that it was strangled to death by Finance Minister Cormann and a finance department that was focused on the blame game rather than on our national interest. Labor continues to call for that report to be made public, and I remain very, very interested indeed to know why its recommendations and its strategy for the shipbuilding industry was never implemented by the very government that commissioned its work. The Valley of Death is now upon us, and a workforce of more than 4,000 people spread across our shipyards in BAE, Forjax, Austal and ASC could now fall to less than 1,000 by 2016 without urgent action. The Pacific patrol boats are a good thing. They go to achieving a policy goal dear to my heart, but they are no salve for the crisis in today's shipbuilding. They are not ships of the size or complexity to make sure that our national shipbuilding capability survives the present storm. So, these are very serious issues of moment. These are very serious challenges for our shipbuilding industry, and of course the dire anxiety will be, for my part, that when C5000 is finally a mature concept and it's going to government for first pass, at that moment in time we will find a Conservative government that is able to say, well, I'm sorry, the shipbuilding industry in this country is dead and that work cannot be accomplished in Australia. And if that juncture is reached, that will be a great tragedy, not simply for the Royal Australian Navy, but for a maritime nation that should and must possess a shipbuilding capability. So let me finish with a few quick points about the Labor's view about these important issues and the view I would carry forward into government. Our preference is to build in Australia because we regard shipbuilding as an essential industry and not the occasional focus of stop-start projects. We believe that bipartisan support is important because, as has been often said, these are projects that must survive the thrills and spills of changes of government. We must ensure that investment delivers optimal return for taxpayers and that it is seen to do so. The challenge is to harness the best of Australian and overseas industry in design, engineering, manufacturing and naval construction, and to subsequently implement a cost-efficient logistics support program. It will be Labor's goal to set capability requirements that are achievable using current proven technologies. Decisions must be made early on combat and weapons systems. There must be strong private sector engagement. and we are committed to using a continuous production model where applicable. Ladies and gentlemen, these are very important issues, and I trust the conversation in the next few days will make sure that they achieve some of the national attention they so very much deserve. Thank you very much.